All right, so paths to speech act participant object indexation in South Central or Kuki-Chin. You'll see what that's about in just a second here. Okay. There we go. Okay, David already told us this. We don't have to worry about it. Broadly, the background to what I want to talk about, in the archaic Tibeto-Burman languages with elaborate verb agreement systems, typically you get hierarchical inverse type alignment in the verbal system and some kind of split ergative case marking. Around the edges of the family in West Himalayan, in South Central, in a few of the languages of Southwest China, you've shifted either the old agreement system or a new one is accusative, and so you have subject agreement. Okay, that's the next slide, right? And interestingly, in these languages, you tend to have more consistent ergative markings. So all the South Central languages have basically consistent ergative or optional ergative marking, but they all have subject agreement. Except that some of them, a lot of them seem to try and innovate some way of also indexing first and second person objects. And that's what I'm going to show you. First, let's look at West Himalayan before we get back down to the friendly climes of Kuki-Chin land. Here are just two examples from Shumcho, which is a Kanawari-ish sort of West Himalayan language. And what you want to see here is that there is this morpheme ta, it's got two allomorphs there. And you get that whenever a non-agent or non-subject argument of the verb is first or second person. So we see it there with a second person object in the first example and a first person object in the second example. As I will mention later on, a lot of people describing this, including Guillaume Jacques, I think, call it an inverse. And maybe we want to call it an inverse, but it's actually a little bit different from the inverse that we get in the hierarchical languages. I'll talk about that toward the end of the talk. So in South Central languages, it's very well known for having an innovative prefixal verb agreement paradigm. There's also a more archaic post-verbal agreement paradigm. I've talked about both of these many times. This makes this branch kind of a fascinating laboratory for looking at the evolution of different kinds of indexation patterns, because the proto-language for the branch had both paradigms present, and the languages over time since then have either been elaborating the prefixal paradigm and slowly getting rid of the other one, or mixing them together. And one of the things that we can see if we look at a survey is what kind of things the languages are really interested in doing. And my point for today is that one of the things they are really interested in doing is making a point of noting if the event that's being described affected you or me. Okay, first, just some basic examples. So in some of the Northwestern peripheral languages like Tedim, you can inflict the verbs either way. So here we see pre-verbal indexation, first person prefix ka, second person na, or you can conjugate them with the post-verbal. So we have a first person ing and a second person te. And sometimes in some of the languages like Moyon, which is another Northwestern languages, things get more complicated as you grammaticalize auxiliaries and they sort of get morphologized on. And so something that used to be a prefix on an auxiliary is now stuck in the middle of the tense aspect sequence. So this ka and na, that's the same as the ka and the na that we saw in the first Tedim paradigm, but they've wandered over to the other side of the verb now. Okay, now what I want to talk about is object indexation. If we look at the subject prefixes, they're quite consistent all across the branch. Few little variations in individual languages, but it's pretty easy to reconstruct subject indexation. If we look at how these languages index object arguments, well, here is just a sample, and you'll see that they are very creative. This is all the evidence that you would need. I think that all of this is secondary, that Proto-South Central undoubtedly indexed subjects, but might not have done any of these things, or at least not consistently the way they do them now. And the interesting point for our purpose, is that in Purum, in Asho, and Sizang, you have a single marker that marks both first and second person. And the fact that this happens over and over, and that we saw it again back in Shumcho, and we'll see it again later on in Karbi, pretty much tells us that this is a natural category, that this is a natural configuration that languages, or at least some kinds of languages like these, like to sort of wander into. Okay, so here's one example of how they've done that in a number of languages, and interestingly, not languages, how shall I say, languages that seem to be drawn from several of the sub-branches. We find this grammaticalization of the verb come, or the cislocative marker on the verb, being pulled into the function of a speech act participant object marker. So Sizang is one that I've talked about often. Tedim does the same thing. Baum, which is a central language, does the same thing. Now this is not that surprising to see. We see the same development in some other languages, including some Northern Naga languages, just a little ways up the Patkai range. Where this gets interesting, though, is let's look at another language, Asho-Chin, which is from the, I don't know, southeastern or southwestern. Anyway, and here, there's a completely different SAP object marker, ma, that is identical to, in Asho, the plural marker. And I suspect that maybe its origin, I have sort of a spooky little story about how possibly that could happen, but I'm not at all convinced that it's true. What's really interesting here is simply that in these two languages, which are pretty closely related, they both decided that they needed a first and second person object marker, and so they both went out and found one lying around and incorporated it into the grammar. Okay, now another thing that we see, you'd sort of expect if a South Central language wanted to innovate object marking, it would be easy enough to do. You've got these proclitics, you could just put two of them together and bang, look at that. We have ka in every form that has a first person argument, and we have na in every form that has a second person argument. And it's like, we just decided, okay, first index is subject, second index is object, go to town. Now this looks like a very clear logical system. You look at this and you say, yeah, I could get behind a language like that. I could learn a language like that. Look at that. However, in some other languages, it seems that they've started from that point and gone in a peculiar direction. So this is Puron. This is another Northwestern language. Look, we have nice regular first person, second person, third person subject indexation. And then, what's this? Okay, it looks just like what was the second person object marker in BOM, but look at it down here in the third person acting on first person form, and it's no longer a second person marker. What this seems to be is now the language has basically extended the second person marker, object marker into the first person object forms. Why would they do that? Presumably this paradigm has to be a later development from something like the BOM paradigm, which we just saw, which, as I said, was so logical and clear. Why would we do this? Unless it's just that, just like Asho and Sizang and Tedim, there's some imperative to have some consistent marking for the speech act participant object category. This does look like it developed out of the second person index. I'm not absolutely sure that's true, because somewhere lurking in the background here, there is also a plural marker that's proclitic to the verb that has an N, that's an N and a vowel. And that doesn't make any sense to me, except that in Asho, as we already saw, we have what looks like maybe the same shift. So I'm not really sure what's going on here. What I am sure of is that we now, within this small and fairly coherent branch, have 3 different pathways that languages have found to end up with this kind of a paradigm where there is a dedicated speech act participant object marker. Okay, now we see the same paradigm here in Chiru, another Northwestern language. But what's kind of cool in Chiru, look, this new is pretty much the same as what we were just looking at in Puram. This nang is not the proclitic, this is the independent second person pronoun. So it appears as though Chiru, starting from the Purim situation, wanted to disambiguate the second person subject and the SAPO markers. So it replaced, okay. The problem is, of course, here, we've got 2 n's. What's this no over here? Is this the second person, or what's going on? Chiru has solved all of that by just cementing this as an SAP object marker without any particular connection to second person by innovating a new second person marker for the purely second person indexation. Why would they do that? I'm not sure, but they did that. Now, what's really interesting actually in Chiru, so in all the Northwestern languages, you get the new prefixal paradigm in affirmative clauses and the old post-verbal paradigm in negative clauses. Everything I've shown you so far is innovation in the preverbal paradigm. But in Chiru, so this is the negative, not the affirmative. So we have the post-verbal paradigm, except we've got this new, they just took it and they added it onto the negative post-verbal paradigm just to make sure that we would have some kind of consistent marking of first and second person object. So again, this seems like it's something that's important to the languages. Now, if you found it a little implausible when I was saying, oh, look what's happened in Purim, they've just taken that old second person marker and extended it to first person objects. And I have had people argue with me, no language would do that, but Harvey has done the same thing, right? As we see here, now we know there's absolutely no question, this is the second person pronoun This is an independent grammaticalization in Carby, but it has developed into a cislocative and along with that into a first and second person object marker. So once again, this seems to be something that our languages like to do. Okay. So, as I said, a number of people, and I don't mean to criticize anyone here, but people who have described this kind of construction have called it an inverse. Now, the classic inverse has this distribution and then sometimes is in the third person on third person, depending on who's more topical. What we're looking at has this distribution. They're not exactly the same thing. I think that for the time being, it's worth keeping them distinct and not calling them by the same term, especially since there does seem to be this strong distributional correlation between this inverse pattern and hierarchical indexation and this SAPO pattern and subject accusative indexation. Anyway, I guess that's what I have to say. I don't really have a big conclusion except keep looking out for this stuff. I'm not sure how much more of it there might be.
Okay, thanks. We have plenty of time for questions.
I'm curious about this M element marking first person objects. I think you pointed it out in maybe a Southern language, but I also see it showing up in the Maraic language, Zopay. I'm wondering where you think this come from. And I'm also curious about in some of these situations where it looks like you've got the same thing for the first and second person marker, if that, if it could be the case that you've got this M element also kind of getting caught in that situation where you're, yeah.
There are at least two different M things that show up in the South Central languages. The one in Asho, the ma, is a plural marker, and it has cognates in Kiranti and I think elsewhere as well. I'm not absolutely sure that as the first and second person object marker in Asho that it comes from the plural, except I can't figure out anywhere else it could come from. And it's absolutely identical. So I think it probably is from that somehow. In Mizo, for example, and Monsang, you get a mi or ma element as a first person object marker. That's completely independent. That's from the root mi meaning person, and it's an old impersonal being reanalyzed as a first person object form. So you have to keep those separate.
It works as a first person plural object in Zopay, so.
First person plural. Yeah, and it's after the verb, right?
It's preverbal.
It's preverbal? Oh, okay. So is it right next to the stem? It comes after the person index?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I could make up a story deriving that from either source. And so my immediate thought is maybe they were both showing up in the paradigm and they just collapsed. And that's kind of why you get a sort of a not obviously motivated set of functions associated with it. But I don't know, I'd have to look at the paradigms.
I mean,
what am I saying? I'll look at the paradigms. I probably won't know even then. But that's...
Could it be that, you know, you were saying that the me, which is the man, then this, so were you saying that was agent or patient?
Patient, first person.
Patient, right, so then because in Lamkang as well, you have an M prefix for patient.
Oh yeah, that's
Same
right.
one for you have an M also for agent, but that's in a different.
But it's in a different, yeah, okay. I don't, Lamkang just confuses me, I have to admit. You know, every other language in the branch I can fit into my scheme, and then Lamkang just sits there and laughs at me, so I don't know what to say.
All right, well, we'll have to fix that. We'll have to figure out why that is. But, yeah. So in the case of the Chiru, and I know this doesn't fit in the big picture, but if I was just looking at just Chiru, was that the one where we had Nung as the second person, right? We had a second person
Yeah, here we go. There's none.
pronoun. Yeah, and then couldn't we say that we're starting with this sequence, Nung Nu, and then the first one, then something with that final Engma position being weaker or something, then we end up with just CV, and that's where we get our sequences for the other languages where we see that happen.
Well, except that you see that in all the other languages except Chiru. So on that account, Chiru is, well, no, actually, even that doesn't work because, all right, if that occurred here, it should also occur down here in the second person object. Okay, originally this is a second person indexed form too. So that account doesn't give any explanation for why these two cells are different.
Hmm.
Anyway, it can't work because there's no question we have to reconstruct the Ka-Na proclitics for Proto-South Central. They didn't develop independently in all the daughter languages.
Right.
So therefore, this is clearly the odd one out.
So Chiru and Purum are quite, Chiru is just standing out as something different, slightly different than, because Purum,
I'm sorry.
again, or?
Sorry, what'd you say?
I was just wondering if we could look at the Purum.
Yeah. Here's a better, there's a good forum for us.
Yeah.
Well, there's my concept of Purim, right? There's obviously room to argue about which nuz should be blue and which ones should be green, or whether that's actually a meaningful distinction at all.
Right.
Okay, a point that I haven't made, but that let me just make here. In Nungish languages like Rawang, and in a couple of Kiranti languages, including Dumi and sort of Kaling, right? There is a prefix which has exactly the distribution of the green na plus this one over here, the second person acting on third, which everybody who works on those languages looks at that and says, what is that? So Van Dream, writing about Dumi, calls it the marked scenario prefix. And Randy LaPala calls it, oh, I can't pull this out, but it's non-first person agent, I think, is what he calls it. But both of them note how odd it is. And in fact, Theodora Bainan wrote a paper about this 20 or 30 years ago about what this weird thing that happens in Dumi. But here we have, you know, unless there's a difference between the green ends and the blue ends, why then we're getting that reproduced again here in a couple of South Central languages, which starts to make it look less and less weird.
Mm.
Sorry, no, it still looks weird. It makes it look less and less unusual.
So you would say, Scott, this is Ken, that BOM is the best system? That's what you were saying?
I would say that what?
The best system.
Best? What do you mean by best?
The neatest.
The most transparent,
Okay.
right? And transparency certainly is one of the qualities that contributes to the value and beauty of a linguistic construction, but not the only one.
Thank you.
I mean, just following that, you know, that thought, then the Carby example where we're analyzing things that we expect to be prefixes as suffixes. I mean, one could just,
Oh, you mean the Monsang example, I think.
was it Monsang or Myong or Monsang? Maybe it was one of those.
This one, Moyon.
Yeah.
Okay, don't tell anybody that I confused Moyon and Monsang.
Okay.
Never mention that anywhere.
You know, this is being recorded, Scott.
We're gonna have to have a talk later on.
And I don't even know
It's
what we're
just
not
because they're
supposed
right
be
next to
mentioning.
each other, that's all. Yeah, so this, right, this ka is a prefix on an old verb, which is now the past tense marker.
Sorry to interrupt, but we are at time if we want to get to the next person.
Which we really should.
All right. Well, thank you. We will continue talking, I guess, later on. Yeah.
All right.